Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues from Yale, members of the professoriate, and students. It is a great honor for myself and my Yale colleagues to be here with you this morning, to be invited to speak, and we thank you for coming out and for joining us. I want first to address the student audience. I was wondering as I looked out a minute ago who might be the youngest student in the audience. Would there be anybody who is just 20 years old or 19 years old? Okay, good. I'm so relieved. You know, the older ancient people who are sitting closer to the podium than you are, we have been through 20 years of the most astonishing ups and downs in modern history. It just occurred to me that 20 years ago, there was still a Soviet Union. There was still a Cold War. There was still a focus on the relationship between Moscow and Washington, and other relationships were less significant. When one part of the Cold War apparatus collapsed, it looked as if the United States was in a position of extreme power relative to everyone else. And it wasn't surprising that after that collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the American commentator Charles Krauthammer wrote an important article in Foreign Affairs called The Unipolar Moment. The international system up to the Second World War had been multipolar with 4 or 5 or 6 big powers. At the end of the Second World War and through the Cold War, it was what my political science colleagues call bipolar, 2 big poles, 2 big powers around which the others moved, although in fact we now see that China was already establishing itself. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was, in Krauthammer's terms, the unipolar moment. But Krauthammer was quite clever in using the noun moment. For historians, a moment is not just a split second. It's a period of time, but it's a distinct period of time. So the question I have been asked to reflect upon this morning is whether now, less than 18 years after Krauthammer's article, we are witnessing the end of the unipolar American-dominated period of world history. To answer that question, I think we have to ask ourselves how we define American power, how we define power and influence in the world. It seems to me, ladies and gentlemen, that if we stay with strictly hard power, that is military power, force projection, Pentagon power, there has not been much shift or diminution in America's relative position. It is now spending 51% of all defense spending of all the countries of the world is being spent by one nation, the United States. So not surprisingly, it still has enormous amounts of hard military power. It is not totally invulnerable because all of that hard military power invested in aircraft carriers and submarines cannot handle international terrorism, cannot handle what we call asymmetric power, is not very good at defending American interests in fragile parts of the world. And secondly, the Pentagon now worries about the significant investments by large Asian states, China and India, in their own modern defense systems, whether it is satellite defense or newer quiet submarines or long-range missiles. It does not mean that any other country is likely to rise to challenge American military power, but that military power, even that, is somewhat constrained and somewhat restricted. When we move to other dimensions of power and influence, the picture looks to me rather more troubled for the United States. If one would consider this pressing issue of economics and finance, even before the current subprime mortgage and bank credit crisis, one could see a significant long-term shift away from a relatively static American and European economic position to a growing influence and capacity of other parts of the world, particularly in Asia. In 1945, when the bipolar world came about, and because of the destruction of the Second World War, the United States had 50% of all world product. Nowadays, depending upon how you calculate it, whether it's currency or purchasing power, the United States has 20 or 21%. Europe has the same. China is rising to about 15%. If you would try to do a pie chart or a pizza slicing of shares of world product, you would see that there are now 3 or 4 big players. And if the growth projections of Asia will continue faster than economic activity in the West, then we will indeed be back on the economic plane to a multipolar world. And even the convulsions of the past month, ladies and gentlemen, would suggest that that is true. You will see, or you will have noticed, of course, with great eagerness, given the impact upon Brazil, that the attempts to manage the crisis could no longer be handled by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York alone. It had to be done by cooperation among the central bankers of the major trading blocs and the major financial blocs. And in fact, the lead role was taken more by European central banks than by the United States. And if we do get some improved architecture for international finance and banking emerging from the crisis, I think that that improved architecture will show this multipolar, multi-headed world. It will be a combination of the central banks of, say, the top 8 or 10 economies working in conjunction to effect an orderly exchange of capital flow under regulations they will increasingly put together. So in the economic and financial world, I think we can already say that the unipolar moment, if it existed in that sphere, has gone. We are into a multipolar world of large trading and financial and currency blocks, all of whom, again it might be a consolation from the crisis, have learned how interdependent they are, and how a crisis which starts with overpriced mortgage lending in Connecticut or Northern Rock Building Society in Yorkshire very quickly hits Russian billionaires, Japanese investors in Las Vegas, and the Brazilian economy as well. And the very fact that this has become so interconnected could actually lead to the central bankers and the treasuries recognizing that they have to work better together, but in a multipolar way. There will no longer be a world in which the US Treasury says, we have the answer and everybody else will follow. It will be different. There is another element of power and influence, ladies and gentlemen, which political scientists often refer to as soft power. Soft power is distinct from the hard military power of the Pentagon's instruments. It's different from the hard economic measure of balance of payments and capital flows. Soft power is usually regarded as the capacity of a nation to be attractive to other nations, to persuade them to follow into decisions which it wants, to use its cultural attractiveness, its ideological appeal, in order to get its way in the world. And it strikes me, my fellow professors will remember this, it strikes me as interesting but not coincidental that just as Krauthammer was writing about the unipolar moment, Professor Joseph Nye at Harvard was writing about this term of his called soft power. And it seemed as if it all went together. There was American military power, there was the economic influence of the dollar, and there was the attractiveness of the American democratic ideal, the coming of democratic elections in large parts of Central America, in the former Soviet Union, in sub-Saharan Africa, especially South Africa. It all went together, and there were this tripolar buttressing of the unique American position. But I don't have to tell people in this audience that significant, soft, ideological, political attractiveness of the United States has been very badly reduced by the last 8 years of Washington administration. I don't have to tell you about international public opinion polls which regard the United States at its lowest level of popularity in the past 100 years. If you or I were able to invite back from their quiet graves Woodrow Wilson or Franklin Roosevelt or John F. Kennedy and tell them that the United States was more unpopular now than it had ever been, they would say, please explain that. Please tell me why. And we would have a long story to tell. So this is why I think that there is such enormous interest in the current presidential election campaign in the United States. There always is interest because the United States has such capacity to do good in the world or capacity to do bad in the world. So its sheer weight means that other countries pay attention. And this time it seems enhanced because you have the phenomenon of the first ever African-American candidate, with the strong possibility in the latest polls of that person being the next president. So there is inordinate excitement. I find it in Brazil, I find it in Europe, I find it in Korea and elsewhere. But I think the excitement is also increased by a hope that the next American leadership, whether it is McCain or Obama, will be less unilateralist, less obsessed with hard power, less concerned with force projection, and more interested in cooperating on the economic and financial instrumentalities on which almost all nations rely for their prosperity, more working together, more like a leadership role of Roosevelt, which was not telling the rest of the world what to do or ignoring the rest of the world. The unipolar moment is over in many regards. It does not mean that America loses its influential position. In my view, it has to be smarter, wiser, more thoughtful. So in the midst of this financial crisis, behind it, longer-term trends of shifts in the economic balances are occurring, and in a rather funny way, and this is my final sentence to you, in a rather funny way, the depth of the crisis may also compel the American leadership to understand how interconnected the world is and how it is just as dependent upon a prosperous, flourishing, peaceful world as is Brazil or France or Japan. The time has gone when neoconservatives in America could say, we can do it alone. That's over. And for my money, that's quite a relief. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.